Gospel of Matthew, it takes 11 verses. In Luke's Gospel, 13. But in Mark's recount of the wilderness temptations, as we've just heard it read, it's just 2 verses. Clearly, we didn't get much by way of details from Mark's Gospel. For instance, there's no mention of Jesus fasting through that time. There's no listing or naming or delineating of the temptations of Satan, as is true in the other Gospels. The wild beasts are not identified, nor are we told exactly how or when the angels came and waited upon him. Mark's account is bare bones, definitely short on details and descriptions. So much so that generally on this first Sunday, when this theme is in this gospel lesson is the suggested text, many preachers choose to turn to Luke or Matthew's telling instead. But not me, not today. I'm staying with Mark, for good or ill. In part, I want to stay with Mark's telling because Mark uses a word that the other Gospels do not employ. It's the one word which I chose for this morning's sermon title: driven. Jesus was, quote, driven by the Spirit into the wilderness, the stony, rocky, desolate, Judean wilderness of unbearable heat by day and unimaginable chill and cold by night. God drove him there before Jesus was even dry from the baptismal waters of the Jordan. Driven. Think about that. Matthew's Gospel changed that verb to Jesus being led up to the wilderness by the Spirit. And Luke softened it even more by writing Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, was led. Now, I would submit to you that to be driven is quite a different matter from being led, full of the Holy Spirit. Now, because of my curiosity about all of this, why Mark uses one word and the others another, I was driven, so to speak, to research the Greek words originally used in the Scriptures. The Greek word used is ekbalo. Ekbalo. Judy will test you all on that later. Ekbalo, translated driven in Mark's Gospel, a word that occurs only one other time in the entire Bible. Would you like to know when? I hope so, because I'm going to tell you. That occasion in John's Gospel was the telling of the story of Jesus driving out the money changers from the temple courts, having formed, according to John's Gospel, a whip of cord, overturning their tables, causing quite the ruckus by his driving them out. So it is, I think, that the clear implication of Mark's use of the word seems that the Spirit was not fooling around here. That Jesus was driven is implies that perhaps it was not even of his own volition that he entered the wilderness that day. It is God's doing. Driven, compelled, sent, cast into, forced, like it or not, Jesus went to the wilderness. And as would always be true, however, for Jesus, his response to God's initiatives and God's intent and God's purpose, we might even say God's will for him, his response is, as it always would be, unhesitant obedience. So to the wilderness, the Spirit drove him. Now, as I approached my preparations for today's sermon, I was also feeling a little driven myself to see if I couldn't find a story or illustration that might neatly catch the essence of my message and, of course, also capture your interest. But all of my usual sources for stories and illustrations were about as dry and as barren as the wilderness into which Jesus was driven. I began to feel stymied and downhearted. Worse, for the first time ever, one of my usual online sources for great stories and illustrations wouldn't even open up. I was feeling a little tested myself. Then, like those angelic ministrations that Jesus received at some point during these 40 days sojourning in the wilderness, I received an email from none other than the Sojourners magazine. In the next to last paragraph of this lengthy, detailed communication, very unmarken-like, written by the founder and lead pastor of a church I'd never heard of out in Seattle, Washington, the author quoted President Obama's address from the National Day of Prayer gathering in Washington, D.C. from a year ago, 2011. Now, you might not know this National Day of Prayer gathering when the president appears is an by invitation only event for clergy. And so he was honored to be there. And at one point he quotes the president as saying, the words of President Obama, "Let me tell you, these past 2 years have deepened my faith. The presidency has a funny way of making a person feel the need to pray." Abe Lincoln said, as many of you know, "I have been driven to my knees many times by the overwhelming conviction that I had no place else to go." End of quote. Now, I feel pretty safe in saying that none of us aspire to the responsibilities of the presidency, but nonetheless, we all have experienced those times of concern or worry about ourselves, our loved ones, our nation, our world, that we might feel driven to our knees, literally or figuratively speaking. And during Lent, if there are times when we feel so driven ourselves, we would be very much in keeping with this gospel lesson where the Lord was driven to the wilderness, and I suspect onto his knees. Now, having heard Reverend Judy's prayer in the first service, she will remind us that we do know what it is to be driven in our lives, generally driven by the ways of the world. But do we know what it's like to be driven by God's Spirit? Another angel reminded me of my having read a little earlier in the week the reflection posted on our Connecticut Conference United Church of Christ weekly email by someone you met a few weeks ago, Karen Zeal, on the staff of the Connecticut Conference, who had come here and worshiped with us, and following that worship, she was a resource person to our Christian Education Committee and Youth Committee. It happened to be her turn to do this brief meditation in the weekly email from our conference. And she noted that she didn't grow up herself in the Christian tradition of the United Church of Christ. Rather, she grew up outside of that tradition, quoting her now, where individual confession was practiced, where my contrition was displayed as I knelt at the communion rail for the community to see, for all the community to see, and where a priest conferred absolution. And then she continued, I confess there are times when that postural act, kneeling for penance, is for me a necessary ritual. End of quote. It sounds to me like the same sort of being driven that Jesus experienced, driven by the Spirit. Now I wonder, what if we were to allow this Lenten season and the work of the Spirit to drive us where it will? Maybe to our knees, literally or figuratively. Perhaps to deepen our commitments and relationships with God, with others in our lives, or with those in need or want. What would it be for us to allow the Spirit to drive us where it will? This I know. If we allow it, after Jesus' example, we will obey it. Of that I'm sure.